On this episode of It's Not That Deep But It's Interesting, we'll be doing a deep dive into the many different timelines that are presented to us in Sailor Moon. Reading through the Sailor Moon manga and watching the recent Crystal to Cosmos adaptations of them, I was intrigued by the use of different timelines throughout the series, and it inspired me to break down the possible timelines showcased throughout and the events which happen in them. Obviously, I just want to start by saying that everything discussed here can easily be explained away by the fact that I don't think Sailor Moon was ever intended to last as long as it did, and each arc that was made introduced new concepts that had to intertwine with past story details. We are first introduced to the idea of there being different timelines when we reach Arc 2 in the manga. It being introduced so early on meant that events that we see in this arc can easily be explained away by saying that at this point future concepts were not thought of. Okay, now that that's out of the way, let's have some fun. The first timeline we're going to cover is the present timeline. This timeline is based around the Sailor Moon that we follow as we journey throughout the series, but to break down the key events that form this reality, Usagi becomes Sailor Moon, gathers the Inners and defeats Metalia. She is powered up at the end of the arc and gains more control over the Silver Crystal. Chibiusa comes from the future, followed by enemies from that timeline, the Black Moon Clan. Sailor Moon, alongside Sailor Chibi Moon and Tuxedo Mask, defeats the leader of the Black Moon, Death Phantom. Neo Queen Serenity then powers up Sailor Moon as well as her guardians. In the next arc, Sailor Moon is empowered by the Holy Grail through combining the powers of the inner and the outer Senshi, and becomes Super Sailor Moon. In the final battle of this arc, she manages to release the power of the Silver Crystal into the earth, purifying it, and while doing so, the burst of power flows to the other Senshi, who upgrade to their super forms. We are then introduced to the Dead Moon and Nehelenia, who Sailor Moon manages to defeat by combining the powers of the inner and outer Senshi yet again, but this time with their more power-intensive princess forms. Their combined power goes into a new Holy Grail object, granting Sailor Moon a permanent new form, Eternal Sailor Moon, and in return, the inners and outers unlock their eternal forms too. Sometime after, we are then introduced to Chibi Chibi, who is Sailor Cosmos. Now would be a good time as ever to remind you about my other video where I go more into depth about Chibi Chibi, Cosmos, and Sailor Moon's other forms. At the very end, Usagi defeats Chaos for now, and we see her and Mamoru get married. So one key takeaway from this timeline is that all Senshi get various visual and powerful upgrades throughout. Chibiusa also plays a huge role in this timeline, especially when it comes to power-ups and development. Like when she reveals that Neo Queen Serenity had a Holy Grail, she attempts to emulate it, and it just happens to evolve into Sailor Moon's Grail instead of it being the same one that Neo Queen Serenity has. In this series, I would say that Timeline 1 acts as a key pivotal convergence point in which major decisions can affect any other timelines set in the future. And speaking of the future, that is where we are introduced to the second timeline in the second arc of the manga and second seasons of both anime adaptations. There are a few reasons why this timeline can be seen as separate to Timeline 1. The most glaringly obvious one is that the inners are wearing their base form uniforms in the future, when at the point where this is set, they should be in their eternal forms. Yes, the correct thing to say here is that the future forms were not planned out at this point, and maybe this was initially supposed to be how they would end up, but you've made it this far into the video, so let's do a deeper dive. In Timeline 2, Neo Queen Serenity would have probably gone through different events of the Sailor Moon of Timeline 1. First off, she would not have had to fight Death Phantom so early on in her magical career. In fact, in Act 26, Neo Queen Serenity says that she lost most of her power to fight as a guardian when she became queen, and that she didn't have the strength of heart or the courage to defeat the vile evildoer Death Phantom, and sealed him away on Nemesis instead, which is how he ended up coming back with a vengeance. King Endymion also talks about how he would tell Chibiusa stories of when the Queen would fight as Sailor Moon, the mighty guardian of legend, and we see one of the early forms of Sailor Moon depicted, which, for argument's sake, we could say that Neo Queen Serenity only ever ended up reaching this form. This would make sense, as if she never had to travel to the future because of Death Phantom and the Black Moon, she would have never received her moon cosmic power makeup transformation from a future version of herself. This is further reinforced by how taboo the meeting between Sailor Moon and Neo Queen Serenity is made out to be, as if it had never been done before in her timeline of events. Just before Neo Queen Serenity powers up her past self with the Moon Cosmic Power makeup transformation, we also see her don her own version of the Heart Moon Rod, an upgrade from the Moon Rod that she used earlier in the arc. This supports a theory that as Timeline 1 Sailor Moon evolves, her future timelines also change to a degree. However, to add another layer to Timeline 2, in the third arc, we are informed that Neo Queen Serenity had access to a Holy Grail that in times of crisis would fill up with power and give her strength to save her people. Chibiusa later remembers Neo Queen Serenity saying that she will see a Sailor Moon who is much stronger than the one you know, Super Sailor Moon. So remember how I said that Chibiusa going back in time is central to the power-ups in Timeline 1? It's demonstrated here as the Grail that Timeline 1 Sailor Moon ends up getting is the one that Chibiusa, Mamoru, and Usagi creates, instead of the one that Neo Queen Serenity of Timeline 2 would have received. So Neo Queen Serenity could have gotten hers in a different way, especially if in her lifetime she didn't have the added benefit of Chibiusa coming back in time and changing things. Ignoring canon narrative roadblocks, it could also be interpreted that the Holy Grail that Neo Queen Serenity had was the Holy Moon Chalice that Sailor Moon unlocks much later on, which could also be feasible if Timeline 2 Sailor Moon did actually manage to fill up her Pokédex of inners and outers. Speaking of the outers, in Timeline 2 we are only made aware of Sailor Pluto existing. This future Pluto is initially confined to the Time Door, unlike the freedom that Timeline 1 Pluto enjoys. Maybe Queen Serenity knew that she would have a crush on Endymion. Anyway, moving on. In the fourth arc, Chibiusa mentions that her mother told her a story about a dark mirror where there is a parallel world, which implies she knew of Nehelenia. Although this isn't concrete, as Mamoru mentions that it's an old European tradition, a folklore if you will. Fast forward and Diana mentions when she sees Eternal Sailor Moon that she possesses power closest to the Queen. So this can be seen as confirmation that Timeline 2 Sailor Moon did reach Eternal form, even though the events probably would not have been the same as Timeline 1. Now, here is where the timelines get a bit tricky. It's completely possible that the next timeline mentioned is actually just the second timeline and its events, and in many ways it is still chronologically presented this way. However, there are some key differences between it and the second timeline. Possible third timeline. In the Cosmos movies, which cover the fifth arc and presumably acts as the definitive versions of the arc, we see the inners of the future in their super uniforms but not their eternal outfits. So this is possibly different to the future we see in Timeline 2, where they are in their first forms with the original brooches. Pluto is initially also alive again, even though Neo Queen Serenity said she would forever sleep peacefully inside the Crystal Palace, although we've seen how she's revived her previously in Timeline 1. Interestingly, in the manga panels of this part of the story, the incapacitated inners are still in their early forms, not super forms, although Mercury has her sleeves. This makes this the most unclear aspect of this potential third timeline, as it's hard to tell if what they are wearing is intentional or a mistake. What I do like about the Senshi and Endymion shown as incapacitated instead of vanished is it shows that while things have happened to them in the past, their fate is not fully yet decided there. This supports why Chibiusa is still able to exist in the future, as Mamoru's death has not been fixed and there is still a chance he'll be saved. Something that the Cosmos movies add in that the manga didn't show is Neo Queen Serenity with an upgraded Eternal Tiara staff, reflecting what Timeline 1 Sailor Moon is currently using too, although we know from before that Neo Queen Serenity's wands are fully upgradable. When Pluto is talking to Neo Queen Serenity about the abnormalities in the past potentially altering history, Neo Queen Serenity seems lost over what's happening in the past. What doesn't make sense here is that Neo Queen Serenity should know what happened in the past at this point, if she also went through the same set of events. This reinforces the point that she went through different events, with Chibiusa and the Black Moon going back in time being catalysts for change in Timeline 1. Timeline 1 Moon has faced enemies that this Neo Queen Serenity would have never fought, so it's indirectly affecting her timeline, especially if characters die in the past. The past seems to act as an anchor whereby major events that happen affect future timelines, but not minor things like uniform changes. I think ultimately Chibiusa going back messed with the timelines because her presence ended up unlocking more events and timeline paths, although it's still totally plausible that Neo Queen Serenity would have gotten all of the other transformations in other ways, seeing as Sailor Moon didn't actually need Chibiusa for most of them. And even with her Moon Crisis makeup transformation, we still have seen her transform without needing Chibiusa. Which means other than the inconsistencies with the Inner's uniforms, Timeline 3 could still be part of Timeline 2. What do you think? Moving on to what I think is the fourth timeline that we're presented with in this series, the Cosmos timeline. Timeline 4 is Cosmos' timeline, as she would have had specific things happen to her that were different to the Sailor Moons of Timeline 1 and 2. I'd like to say that she's closest in key events to Timeline 1, as it's shown that she went through the battle with Chaos that Timeline 1 Sailor Moon was going through, versus how Neo Queen Serenity in the 5th arc has no idea of what's happening in the past. Quick pivot, but I just want to point out how interesting the parallel between Neo Queen Serenity and Cosmos' story is. Now we know from the second timeline that Neo Queen Serenity says that she didn't have the courage to defeat Death Phantom, who we learn later on is just another form of chaos. This mirrors and is almost a prelude to Cosmos' speech where she says she couldn't face the future and didn't have the courage to face her fears when facing Sailor Chaos. If Neo Queen Serenity felt fatigued by her fight with Death Phantom, then for sure Cosmos having multiple exposures to chaos over time would have worn her down. We could argue that a key difference between Timeline 4 Cosmos and Timeline 1 Sailor Moon is that Cosmos would not have had the extra hope and courage bestowed upon her via Chibi Chibi coming back to guide her, and knowledge of how things would turn out. It's possible that with Cosmos travelling to Timeline 1, it ultimately would change Usagi's fate, as she would be expectant of events to play out a certain way and so would be more equipped to deal with such issues. Another possible timeline that deserves a mention but is fairly vague is one that might exist with an adult Chibiusa, Princess Lady Serenity. In the 4th arc, Helios sees a prophecy of Princess Lady Serenity warning him of events to come, which could have been a tiny glimpse of another timeline far into the future where Chibiusa has grown up. Unfortunately, that's all we see of that. So, I know what you're thinking at this point. All of these theories, but nothing's concrete, and that's true, but it is nice to form some of these ideas based on the crumbs we were left in the series. All in all, it seems like Timeline 1 is shaped up to be the most definitive timeline. This particular Usagi has so many unique bonds ranging from the inners to the outers to Neo Queen Serenity, Chibi Chibi, the Starlights, some of the villains, and Sailor Cosmos. This helped to polish her development and strengthen her will to push through the multiple difficult scenarios. There were also some extra cross-dimensional benefits such as Neo Queen Serenity upgrading Sailor Moon and the Inners early on and sending a revived Pluto back into the timeline. She also manages to get key information from future events which could help her remain steadfast in her resolve knowing the struggles that will come. This is especially interesting as there were hints near the end of how things could play out, with Galaxia from Timeline 1 getting corrupted by Wise Man on another planet. This implies that the Wise Man of this time has yet to come, so it could all still be cyclical and Black Moon might still attack later on, but at least Sailor Moon will be prepared this time. Arguably, the 90s anime deals with the issue of time better, but only because there's a lack of focus on it. Past the second arc, we don't see the day-to-day life of the future Senshi other than letters from Neo Queen Serenity. Sailor Moon also receives all of her power-ups in the present time, which would be an easier roadmap of events for any future forms of her to emulate. The only indication of there being major cross-timeline changes which could impact the future is a scene in Sailor Stars where Pluto mentions that if Mamoru isn't released from Nehelenia's control, it means that Usagi and Mamoru won't end up together and so Chibiusa won't be born. Other than that, it's much more straightforward in this adaptation. So, that was my take on the timelines in Sailor Moon. That was an incredibly extra and non-necessary deep dive, but it was an interesting swim regardless. What are your theories on timelines in Sailor Moon? Do you think Chibiusa played a pivotal role in changing up events? Let me know in the comments and let's discuss. I hope you enjoyed this episode of It's Not That Deep But It's Interesting. See you next time, maybe.